frontier was a harsh land, cold and unforgiving in the winter months. Snow covered the ground in deep drifts, and the trees stood silent, their branches heavy with ice. In this wild place, far from the growing towns of the colonists, lived a young boy named Tun. He belonged to the Kanien'keha, a people who lived in harmony with the land, respecting the forests and the animals. His village was a cluster of sturdy longhouses made of wood and bark, nestled deep in the valley. The air always smelled of wood smoke and the rich scent of pine, a comforting presence against the biting cold. He spent his days learning to hunt with a bow and arrow, his footsteps light in the fresh snow, his eyes always watching for the smallest sign of movement in the trees. One day, when the sun was low and the shadows were long, Tun saw something strange near the edge of the forest. Smoke, not from a friendly fire, was rising above the trees. He ran back to the village, his heart pounding against his ribs to warn his mother. But it was too late. Men, pale-skinned and wearing dark coats, burst into the village, carrying torches and loud guns. They did not speak the language of his people. The air filled with shouts and the terrible smell of burning wood. Tun watched in horror as his home began to burn, the flames licking at the familiar walls of the longhouses. He tried to find his mother in the chaos, but the smoke was thick, burning his eyes and throat. He saw his mother trapped inside their burning longhouse. He called her name, but the flames were too fierce. He tried to reach her, but the heat pushed him back. The last thing he saw was her face through the smoke, her eyes wide with fear, before the roof collapsed with a roar. Tun was dragged away by a neighbor, his body weak with shock, as the village burned around him. The image of his mother trapped in the fire would haunt his dreams for years to come. He would remember the face of one of the pale-skinned men, a man with a stern face and a dark cloak, who seemed to be giving orders. This man's image would be burned into his memory, a silent promise of future justice. The surviving people of the village rebuilt their homes, but the joy was gone. The air in the rebuilt village felt heavy with sadness. Tun grew up in this shadow, his heart carrying the weight of his mother's death. He spent his days in the forest, hunting and training, but he often felt a restless anger inside him. He knew that the men who burned his village were not just random attackers. He learned that they were part of a larger group, moving across the land, taking what they wanted. He began to understand that the world outside his village was a dangerous place, filled with people who did not respect the natural order of life. As he grew older, the elders of his tribe shared stories of a hidden burden, a heavy responsibility that had fallen upon their people long ago. They spoke of ancient knowledge and powerful artifacts that needed to be protected from those who sought to control them. They spoke of a man known as the Keeper, a person who would guide their people when the time was right. Tun listened intently to these tales, feeling a connection to something larger than himself. He felt a growing sense that he was meant for more than just hunting in the forest. He knew he had a purpose, a path that was waiting for him, but he did not yet know what it was. One day, the village was visited by a woman from a distant tribe, a shaman named Canidi Io. She was old, with wise eyes and a calm voice. She spoke to Ratinenhake Tun, telling him that she saw a great destiny within him. She spoke of a vision, a sign that would appear to him when he was ready. She told him to seek the truth, to find the balance between the ways of his people and the ways of the new world. Ratinenhake Tun trusted her words. He began to spend even more time in the forest, meditating and training, preparing himself for whatever lay ahead. The air around Canidi Io always smelled of dried herbs and the earth, a smell that brought him a strange sense of comfort. When he was a young man, a vision came to him while he was sleeping in the forest. He saw a great eagle flying over the land, its wings wide against the sky. The eagle led him to a clearing where a glowing symbol was carved into a stone. It was the symbol of the assassins, though Ratinenhake Tun did not know its name then. The vision showed him that his path lay with this symbol, that he was meant to find its meaning and use its power to protect his people. He awoke with a clear purpose in his mind. He knew he had to leave his village and seek out the people who understood this symbol. Ratinenhake Tun spoke to the elders, telling them of his vision. They understood his calling and gave him a powerful mission. They explained that the symbol he saw was tied to ancient knowledge, and that those who sought to control the world, the Templars, were trying to find it. The elders gave him a powerful artifact, a glass orb, and told him to seek out a man named Achilles Davenport. They said that Achilles was a part of the group represented by the symbol, and he would guide Ratinenhake Tun on his path. They gave him a new name for his journey, a name he would be known by in the new world, Connor. Connor began his long journey, leaving his village behind. He traveled through vast forests and dangerous mountains, moving silently through the wilderness. The air was always changing, from the scent of pine to the damp smell of swamps. He encountered wild animals and hostile soldiers on his path, but he moved with a quiet determination, his bow and tomahawk always ready. He had learned to survive in the wilderness, but he knew the world he was entering would be different. He was no longer just a hunter. He was a seeker of truth, carrying the hopes of his people on his young shoulders. After weeks of travel, Connor finally reached the edge of a small colonial town. It was a bustling place, filled with people wearing strange clothes and speaking a loud, unfamiliar language. The air here was full of the smell of horses, wood smoke, and something sweet from the bakeries. He felt like a stranger in a strange land, but he remembered the words of his elders and the vision of the eagle. He knew he had to find Achilles Davenport, the man who would help him understand his purpose and fight against the darkness that had burned his village. He carried the glass orb carefully in his pouch, a constant reminder of his mission. Found the Davenport homestead on a lonely stretch of coast, a large manor house that stood silent against the gray sky. The house looked old and uncared for, with broken windows and overgrown gardens. The air around it felt heavy and sad. Connor approached the front door and knocked, his hand feeling strange against the polished wood. The door was opened by an old man with a tired face and a stern expression. This was Achilles Davenport, and he looked nothing like the powerful leader Connor had imagined. He was a broken man, living alone in a decaying house, seemingly without hope. Achilles listened to Connor's story with a deep weariness. He was no longer a part of the hidden war, having lost faith in the Brotherhood after his own failures and losses. He looked at Connor with a skeptical eye, telling him that the time of the assassins was over and that the young man should return to his village. But Connor refused to leave. He knew that his path was tied to this old man, and he would not give up until he had found the truth. He stood his ground, silent and unmoving, a symbol of the new hope that Achilles had long forgotten. The air between them was thick with unspoken history. Connor did not leave the doorstep of the manor. He sat on the porch through the rain and the cold night, his back against the weathered wood of the house. He watched the ocean waves crash against the rocks at the bottom of the cliff, the sound a constant roar in the damp air. The smell of salt and wet earth was everywhere. Inside the house, Achilles watched the young man through the window, his expression unreadable. For days, Connor remained there, showing a patience that only those born to the forest possess. He did not ask for food or warmth. He only waited for the chance to fulfill the mission his people had given him. The silence was broken when a group of men arrived at the homestead. They were local troublemakers, looking to take advantage of an old man living alone in a large house. They shouted threats and began to break the wooden fence surrounding the garden. Connor stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not use his weapons at first, but his presence was enough to make the men hesitate. When they lunged at him, he moved with the speed of a mountain lion. He disarmed the first man with a quick strike to the wrist and pushed the others back with a strength that surprised them. From the doorway, Achilles watched the fight, seeing the raw potential in the way Connor moved. After the men fled into the woods, Achilles finally stepped out and told Connor to come inside. The interior of the manor was dark and smelled of old books and cold ash. Achilles led him to a small room filled with dusty furniture and maps of the colonies. He explained that he had once been the leader of the Brotherhood in these lands, but the Templars had hunted them down until he was the only one left. He spoke of the man Connor had seen in his childhood, a man named Connor Kenway, who was the leader of the Templars in America. The air in the room felt heavy as Achilles spoke the name. Connor realized that his personal quest for revenge was now part of a much larger war for the future of the continent. Achilles agreed to train him, but he warned that the path would be filled with pain and that there were no easy victories. Training began the next morning at sunrise. The air was crisp and the grass was covered in a thick layer of frost. Achilles did not start with weapons. He started with the mind. He made Connor spend hours studying the maps of Boston and New York, learning the names of the men who controlled the ports and the banks. He taught him about the politics of the colonies and the growing tension between the British Crown and the local people. Connor found this more difficult than hunting in the forest, as the rules of the city were hidden and complex. He struggled to understand why men fought over pieces of paper and taxes, but he listened because he knew he needed this knowledge to find his enemies. Physical training followed in the woods around the homestead. Achilles pushed him to climb the tallest oaks and leap between the branches without making a sound. The air high in the trees was thin and cold, and the wind whipped at Connor's hair. He practiced using the hidden blade, a weapon Achilles had recovered from a locked chest in the cellar. He learned how to move through a crowd without being noticed, blending in with the laborers and the sailors. Achilles showed him how to use the environment to his advantage, turning a common alleyway or a stack of hay into a hiding place. Connor felt his skills growing sharper, his body becoming a tool for the work ahead. As months passed, the homestead began to change. Connor spent his spare time repairing the fences and the roof of the manor, the sound of his hammer echoing through the quiet valley. The air began to smell of fresh pine and new paint. Other people started to arrive at the edge of the property, seeking a place to live away from the turmoil of the cities. Connor helped a woodworker named Godfrey and a blacksmith named Dave establish their homes and workshops. He realized that by building a community, he was creating a stronghold for the Brotherhood. The homestead was no longer a place of death and sadness. It was becoming a place of life and hope. One afternoon, Achilles took Connor down to a hidden cave beneath the cliffs. The air inside was cool and smelled of damp stone. Hidden behind a wall of vines was a large wooden ship, its hull scarred by years of service on the sea. Achilles called it the Aquila. He explained that a master of the land must also be a master of the water. He introduced Connor to Robert Faulkner, an old sailor with a face like tanned leather. Faulkner began to teach Connor how to read the winds and the currents of the Atlantic. They spent days on the deck of the ship, the air filled with the scent of tar and the spray of the ocean. Connor felt a new kind of freedom on the water, a sense of power that the forest could not provide. The final part of his initial training was the most difficult. Achilles took him to a small room at the top of the manor and showed him a set of white and blue robes, the traditional clothing of the assassins. He explained that the robes were a symbol of the creed, the idea that nothing is true and everything is permitted. He told Connor that this did not mean he could do whatever he wanted, but that he was responsible for his own actions and the consequences they brought. Connor felt the weight of the fabric in his hands, realizing that he was no longer just a member of his tribe. He was a protector of the entire world, a silent blade in the dark. Achilles decided it was time for Connor to enter the world. He gave him a list of names, men in Boston who were working for Connor Kenway to tighten the Templar grip on the city. The air in the study was quiet as Connor looked at the names. He knew that the men on this list were responsible for the suffering of many, and he felt a cold determination to stop them. He packed his gear, including his bow, his tomahawk, and the hidden blade. He said goodbye to the people of the homestead, promising to return once his work was done. Achilles watched him go, a flicker of pride in his old eyes. The journey to Boston took several days. As Connor approached the city, the air changed from the fresh scent of the woods to the heavy smell of coal smoke and livestock. He saw the tall spires of the churches and the crowded docks filled with British warships. The streets were packed with people in colorful clothes, their voices a constant roar of noise. Connor felt a moment of hesitation, the scale of the city overwhelming his senses. But then he remembered the vision of the eagle and the memory of his mother's face in the fire. He pulled his hood over his head and stepped into the crowd, a shadow moving among the living. He found a small tavern near the docks where he was supposed to meet a contact. The air inside was thick with the smell of cheap ale and tobacco. Men were shouting about the new taxes and the arrogance of the British soldiers. Connor sat in a dark corner, his eyes watching the door. He felt the eyes of the city on him, a stranger with bronze skin and a quiet manner. He knew that his war had finally begun. The men he was hunting were close, and he would not stop until the light of the Templars was extinguished from this land. He waited for the signal, his hand resting near the hidden blade. The streets of Boston were a maze of brick and mud, where the air felt tight and smelled of salt fish and wet coal. Connor moved through the crowds like a ghost, his white hood drawn low to hide his face. He met his contact, a man named Samuel Adams, who was a leader among the people who wanted to be free from British rule. Adams was a man of quick words and sharp eyes. He showed Connor how to use the city to his advantage, teaching him how to tear down posters of wanted men to lower the suspicion of the guards. They walked past red-coated soldiers who stood on every corner, their muskets gleaming in the gray light. The tension in the air was thick, like the moments before a summer storm. Connor's first target was a man named William Johnson. Johnson was using his wealth and power to try and buy the lands belonging to the native tribes, including Connor's own people. To get close to him, Connor had to learn how the city worked. He helped the local citizens who were being bullied by tax collectors, and in return, they gave him information about Johnson's movements. He learned that the Templars were not just soldiers. They were people who used money and laws to put chains on others. The air in the city felt heavy with the weight of these secrets. Connor spent his nights on the rooftops, looking down at the lanterns of the British patrols, waiting for the right moment to strike. The opportunity came during a meeting at a large stone manor on the edge of the city. Johnson was there, trying to force the tribal leaders to sign away their homes. Connor approached the manor from the trees, moving silently over the stone walls. The air was cold and still. He saw Johnson standing on a balcony, holding a quill as if it were a weapon. With a sudden movement, Connor leaped from the shadows. The struggle was short. As Johnson lay dying, he told Connor that he was only trying to protect the tribes by bringing them under Templar order. Connor did not believe him. He saw only the greed and the lies. He took a small Templar ring from the man's finger and vanished back into the woods before the guards could react. He returned to the homestead to show the ring to Achilles. The old man sat in his chair by the fire, the orange light dancing on the walls of the study. He told Connor that this was only the beginning. The Templars were deeply rooted in the colonies, and to remove them, Connor would have to join forces with the men who were planning a revolution. Achilles explained that the fight for the land and the fight for the Brotherhood were now the same thing. The air in the manor was quiet as Connor looked at the maps again. He saw that the war was spreading, and he would have to go back into the heart of the conflict to find the men who had burned his village. The next mission took him to the docks of Boston. The British had placed a high tax on tea, and the people were furious. Samuel Adams and his friends had a plan to dump the tea into the harbor to protest the king's laws. Connor joined them under the cover of darkness. The air at the docks was cold and smelled of tar and stagnant water. He stood on the deck of a massive wooden ship, using his tomahawk to break open the heavy crates. The sound of wood splitting and the splash of tea hitting the water filled the night. British soldiers arrived to stop them, and Connor fought them off to protect the protesters. He moved with a fierce energy, his blades flashing in the moonlight. By dawn, the harbor was covered in floating leaves, and the message had been sent. Through these actions, Connor gained the trust of the colonial leaders. He met a man named George Washington, a tall soldier with a calm and serious manner. Washington was the leader of the Continental Army, and he spoke of a future where all men were equal. Connor felt a sense of hope in Washington's words, though he still felt like an outsider in this world of white men. The air in Washington's camp smelled of wood smoke and wet canvas. Connor agreed to help the army, seeing them as a way to weaken the Templar influence over the colonies. He became a scout, using his skills as a hunter to find the positions of the British troops and deliver messages through the dangerous wilderness of the frontier. However, the war brought new troubles. Connor discovered that the Templars were not just on the side of the British. Some were hiding within the colonial ranks, playing both sides to ensure they stayed in power. He learned of a man named John Pitcairn, a British officer who was using the war to crush the spirit of the people. To find Pitcairn, Connor had to travel to the fields of Lexington and Concord. The air there was different from the city. It was the smell of grass and gunpowder. He watched as the first shots of the revolution were fired, the smoke from the muskets rising in thick clouds over the green hills. He rode a horse through the lines of fire, delivering the warning that the British were coming. He found Pitcairn in the middle of a massive battle. The sound of cannons and the screams of men filled the air. Connor used the chaos to slip behind the British lines, climbing the trees to stay above the smoke. He he saw Pitcairn sitting on a white horse, giving orders to his men. Connor leaped from a high branch, his hidden blade finding its mark. As he died, Pitcairn claimed he was trying to prevent a war that would kill thousands. Connor looked at the bodies on the field and felt a deep sadness. He realized that the truth was often buried under the noise of battle. He took the second ring and began the long walk back to his horse, the air thick with the smell of spent powder. When he returned to the homestead, he found Achilles looking weaker. The old man's breath was short, and the air in the house felt heavy with age. Achilles told Connor that Assassin Kenway, his father, was moving to New York. The city was the center of the Templar operations, and it was where the final pieces of the puzzle would be found. Connor felt a mix of anger and curiosity about the man who had abandoned his mother and led the enemies of his people. He knew he could not avoid his father forever. He spent a few days at the homestead, helping the blacksmith and the farmers, finding a brief peace in the quiet work of the land. He prepared his gear for the journey to New York. He sharpened his tomahawk and checked the strings on his bow. He looked at the 2 rings he had collected, symbols of the men he had defeated. He knew the road ahead would be the most difficult yet. The air was turning cold as winter approached, and the war was showing no signs of ending. He said a quiet goodbye to Achilles and walked down to the docks to find the Aquila. He would sail to the great city and face the man who sat at the heart of the darkness. The eagle circled high above the cliffs, its cry echoing in the crisp morning air. New York was a city of contrasts, where the air was thick with the smell of salt water and charred wood. A massive fire had recently torn through the streets, leaving a great scar of blackened timber and ash in the center of the town. Connor walked through the ruins, seeing the families living in tents among the rubble. The British soldiers here were more numerous and more aggressive, their red coats a constant presence against the gray stone of the buildings. He met his contacts in the city, but his mind was focused on one thing: the location of Assassin Kenway. He learned that his father was searching for a traitor within the Templar ranks, a man named Benjamin Church, who had stolen supplies and gold. Connor found Assassin in a small, shadowed alleyway near the docks. The air was cold and damp. It was the first time they had stood face to face as men. Assassin was older than the man in Connor's memories, his hair touched with gray, but his eyes were sharp, and his posture was perfect. He wore a tricorn hat and a long blue coat, looking every bit the nobleman. There was no hug or warm greeting. Instead, there was a tense silence. Assassin looked at his son with a mix of curiosity and cold calculation. He suggested that they work together to find Church, as their goals for the moment were the same. Connor hesitated, the air between them filled with years of unspoken anger, but he eventually nodded. He knew he needed Assassin to get closer to the heart of the Templar Order. They traveled to the frontier, chasing leads on Church's location. Moving through the trees with his father was a strange experience for Connor. While Connor moved with the fluid grace of a forest predator, Assassin moved with a calculated, efficient stride. They did not talk about the past. Instead, they argued about the future of the colonies. Haytham spoke of the need for order and the dangers of a revolution led by common men, while Connor spoke of the right of every person to be free. The air in the forest was crisp, but the conversations were heated. Connor began to see that his father was not a simple monster, but a man who truly believed that his way was the only way to save the world from chaos. They eventually tracked Church to a hidden fort guarded by mercenaries. The air was filled with the smell of wet gunpowder and pine. Connor and Haytham worked together with a deadly efficiency that surprised them both. They moved through the fort like a single storm, their blades and pistols working in a rhythm. Connor saw where his own skill had come from. Haytham was a master of combat, his movements precise and without waste. They found Church in a small room at the back of the fort. Before he died, Church mocked them both, claiming that their war was a waste of time. Haytham finished him without a word, taking back the stolen goods. The air in the room felt heavy with the smell of blood and old wood. Despite their success, the partnership did not bring them closer. They returned to New York, where the air was heavy with the coming winter. Haytham took Connor to a secret meeting of the Templar leaders, hoping to show his son the value of their order. Connor saw men discussing taxes, trade routes, and the control of the press. He realized that the Templars did not want to destroy the world, they wanted to own it. He told his father that a world where people were told what to think and how to live was no world at all. Haytham only shook his head, his face a mask of disappointment. The air in the room felt cold, the bridge between father and son crumbling further with every word spoken. Tension reached a breaking point when news arrived from the frontier. The British were planning an attack on Connor's village, believing the tribes were helping the rebels. Connor turned to his father, demanding to know if he had ordered the attack. Haytham admitted that he knew about it, but felt it was a necessary part of the war. Connor felt a surge of the old anger, the memory of the fire from his childhood rushing back. He realized that his father would always choose his order over the lives of innocent people. He told Haytham that their truce was over, and that the next time they met, it would be as enemies. He turned and ran into the night, the air cold against his face as he raced toward his home. He reached the village just as the sun was beginning to rise. The air was clear and still. He found his people preparing for war, their faces painted and their weapons ready. He tried to tell them that the attack was a trap, that they should flee instead of fight. But his people were tired of running. They looked at Connor in his white robes and saw a stranger, someone who had spent too much time in the world of the pale-skinned men. They did not listen to his warnings. Connor felt a deep sense of failure. He had tried to be a bridge between two worlds, but now he found himself standing alone in the middle. The British troops arrived shortly after, their red coats a bright line against the green of the valley. The air was suddenly filled with the roar of muskets and the screams of the wounded. Connor fought to protect his people, moving through the chaos with a desperate energy. He tried to target the officers to break the British formation, but there were too many. He saw his childhood friends falling in the grass, their blood staining the earth he had grown up on. The smell of smoke and death was everywhere. By the time the British retreated, the village was in ruins once more. Connor sat among the debris, his hands shaking, the weight of the loss crushing his spirit. He realized then that the Templars were using the war to wipe out anyone who stood in their way. He knew he had to return to New York and face the man at the center of it all. He thought of Achilles, sitting alone in the manor, and realized that the old man had been right. There were no easy victories. He picked up his tomahawk and cleaned the blood from the blade. The air was cold, and the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, covering the bodies in a white sheet of silence. He began the long walk back to the city, his heart hardened by the loss. He was no longer a seeker of truth. He was a bringer of justice. He reached the outskirts of New York as the harbor began to freeze. The air was sharp and bit at his skin. He saw the British flags flying over the fort and knew that Haytham would be there. He moved through the city with a single-minded focus, avoiding the patrols and the crowds. He felt the eyes of the city on him, but he did not care. He was a shadow moving toward the light of the final confrontation. He reached the gates of the fort and looked up at the stone walls. The eagle circled high above, a lonely shape against the gray sky. Connor stepped into the shadows, his hand resting on the hilt of his hidden blade, ready to end the cycle of violence. The interior of Fort George was a place of shadows and the heavy scent of sea salt and iron. Connor moved through the stone corridors with a quiet intensity, his heart heavy with the weight of the betrayals he had witnessed. He found Haytham in a large, circular room overlooking the harbor. The windows were frosted with ice, and the air inside was cold enough to see one's breath. Haytham was standing by a fireplace, the orange glow of the embers reflecting in his eyes. He did not look surprised to see his son. He looked tired, as if the weight of his own order had finally begun to press down on him. There were no words left to say. The air between them was tight, like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. The fight began with a sudden flash of steel. Haytham moved with a precision that came from decades of combat, his sword whistling through the air. Connor used his tomahawk to parry the strikes, the sound of metal against metal echoing off the stone walls. They moved in a circle, each waiting for the other to make a mistake. Haytham spoke as they fought, his voice calm and cold. He told Connor that the world would always need someone to lead it, and that the freedom the assassins fought for was nothing more than a dream. Connor did not answer. He focused on the rhythm of his father's breathing, looking for the small opening that would allow him to end the struggle. The battle moved across the room, knocking over heavy wooden chairs and scattering maps across the floor. Connor felt the strength of his father's arms as they locked blades. He saw the scars on Haytham's hands and the hardness in his face. Despite everything, he felt a flicker of sadness for the man who could have been his teacher and his guide. But the memory of the burning village and the faces of his fallen friends kept his resolve firm. He pushed forward, using his youth and speed to drive Haytham back toward the center of the room. The air was filled with the sound of their heavy breathing and the occasional crackle of the fire. In a final, desperate move, Haytham lunged forward, trying to catch Connor off balance. Connor dropped to one knee and extended his hidden blade. The metal slid home with a quiet thud. The room went silent. Haytham froze, his eyes widening as he looked down at the blade in his chest. He slumped against his son, his weight heavy and real. He whispered his final words, telling Connor that he was proud of his skill, even if he hated his cause. Then, the light faded from his eyes. Connor held his father for a moment before laying him gently on the floor. The air in the room felt empty, the fire in the hearth finally burning down to cold ash. Connor took the final Templar ring from his father's finger. He felt no joy in the victory, only a deep and hollow exhaustion. He walked out of the fort and into the cold New York night. The snow was falling heavily now, covering the city in a thick, white blanket. He moved toward the docks, wanting to be away from the stone walls and the smell of death. He realized that with Haytham gone, the heart of the Templar order in the colonies had been broken. But the war was far from over. The British were still in control of the cities, and the revolution was still hanging by a thread. The air was sharp and bit at his skin, a reminder that the world was still a harsh place. He returned to the homestead to tell Achilles what had happened. He found the old man in his bed, his face pale and his breathing shallow. The air in the bedroom smelled of lavender and old age. Achilles listened to the news of Haytham's death with a quiet nod. He told Connor that his work was almost complete, but there was one more person who needed to be dealt with: Charles Lee. Lee was the man who had been at the village during the fire, the one who had truly led the attack on Connor's childhood. Achilles handed Connor a final set of instructions and told him to go. He said he would wait for Connor to return before he took his final rest. The hunt for Charles Lee led Connor back to the frontier, and then into the heart of the colonial military camps. He saw that the revolution was changing. The men who had been fighting for freedom were now becoming the leaders of a new government. He saw George Washington again and realized that even the great general was struggling with the power he had been given. Connor felt a growing sense of disillusionment. He had fought for the freedom of his people, but he saw that the new land being built might not have a place for them. The air in the camps was full of the talk of new laws and new borders, none of which seemed to include the forest tribes. He finally tracked Charles Lee to a small, busy tavern near the docks in a different town. The air inside was thick with the smell of smoke and cheap rum. Lee was not the proud soldier he had once been. He was a broken and desperate man, hiding in the shadows. When he saw Connor, he didn't fight. He simply stood up and walked out toward the water. Connor followed him to a quiet spot on the pier. They sat together on a wooden bench, two men who had been destroyed by the same war. Lee looked out at the ocean, his eyes tired. Connor did not say anything. He simply ended the man's life with a quick, clean strike. The air was still, and the water was calm. With Lee gone, the personal quest that had started in the smoke of his burning village was over. Connor felt a strange sense of emptiness. He had spent his entire life focused on this goal, and now there was nothing left but the future. He walked back through the town, seeing the British ships preparing to leave the harbor for good. The revolution had succeeded, and a new nation was being born. He should have felt happy, but he knew that the cost had been too high. He thought of his mother, his village, and his father. He realized that the world he had fought for was not the one that was arriving. He began the long walk back to the homestead, the air turning warm as spring approached. The trees were beginning to bud, and the birds were returning to the forest. He felt the weight of the hidden blade on his wrist and the tomahawk at his side. He was still an assassin, and he still had a duty to protect the land, but he knew his role would be different now. He was a man of two worlds who belonged to neither. He looked up and saw the eagle circling high above, its wings catching the light of the morning sun. He took a deep breath of the fresh forest air and quickened his pace, ready to see the old man who had become his true father. The walk back to the homestead was a quiet one. The air in the valley was soft and carried the scent of damp earth and new grass. Connor saw that the small community he had helped build was thriving. The smoke from the blacksmith's forge rose steadily into the blue sky, and the sound of laughter came from the farmers working the fields. But as he approached the large manor on the hill, he felt a familiar weight in his chest. The house was silent. He stepped onto the porch and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The air inside was still and smelled of cold wax and old paper. He went up the stairs to the bedroom where he had left Achilles, his footsteps sounding loud on the floorboards. He found Achilles in his bed, looking even smaller than before. The old man's eyes were closed, and his skin was like pale parchment. Connor sat in the chair by the bedside, watching the steady, shallow rise and fall of the man's chest. For hours, neither of them spoke. The light in the room shifted from the bright yellow of afternoon to the deep orange of sunset. Finally, Achilles opened his eyes and looked at Connor. He did not ask about the mission or the rings. He simply smiled, a small and tired movement. He told Connor that he had done well, and that the Brotherhood was safe in his hands. The air in the room felt thick with a quiet peace as the sun finally dipped below the horizon. Achilles passed away that night. Connor found him in the morning, looking as though he had simply fallen into a deep sleep. He felt a profound sense of loss, sharper even than the anger he had felt for his father. Achilles had been the one to give him a purpose, to teach him the ways of the world, and to show him that even a broken man can build something beautiful. Connor spent the day preparing for the burial. He dug the grave on the hill overlooking the ocean, near the spot where Achilles, wife, and son were buried. The air was filled with the sound of the waves and the cry of the gulls. The entire community from the homestead gathered for the funeral. They stood in silence as Connor placed the old mentor in the earth. He did not speak a long eulogy. Instead, he recited a prayer in the language of his people, a soft rhythm that mixed with the wind. He felt the eyes of the blacksmith, the woodworker, and the farmers on him. They looked to him as their leader now, the master of the land they called home. He realized that Achilles had not just left him a mission, he had left him a family. The air was cool and carried the salt of the sea as the first shovelful of dirt hit the wooden casket. After the burial, Connor returned to the empty manor. He walked through the rooms, looking at the maps and the books that had been his school for so many years. He went down to the hidden cellar where the robes and weapons were kept. He saw the empty chair where Achilles used to sit and the shelf where the journals of the Brotherhood were stored. He felt a heavy responsibility. He was the only assassin left in the colonies, a lone guardian of a creed that most people did not even know existed. He sat at the desk and began to write, recording the events of the war and the lessons he had learned. The air in the cellar was cool and smelled of stone and old ink. He spent the following weeks organizing the affairs of the homestead. He ensured that the people had the supplies they needed and that the land was protected. He found a hidden letter addressed to him in Achilles' desk. In the letter, Achilles apologized for being so hard on him and thanked him for bringing life back to a house that had been dead for a long time. He told Connor that the world was changing and that he must continue to be the voice for those who have no voice. Connor folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pouch, a final gift from the man who had become his father. One afternoon, Connor traveled back to his village to see the people he had left behind. The air in the valley was familiar, smelling of pine and wood smoke. He found the elders sitting around a central fire, their faces lined with age and worry. They told him that the war had ended, but the peace was not what they expected. The new government was already talking about moving the tribes further west to make room for new settlers. They looked at Connor's white robes and his metal weapons with a mix of awe and fear. He realized that even though he had fought for their freedom, he had become a stranger to them. He felt a deep ache in his heart, knowing that the world he wanted to save was disappearing. He walked to the site of his old home where his mother had died. The grass had grown over the charred wood, and small flowers were beginning to bloom among the ruins. The air was quiet. He stood there for a long time, thinking about the path he had taken. He had avenged his mother and his people, but he could not bring back the life they once had. He realized that the war for freedom never truly ends, it just changes shape. He took the glass orb the elders had given him and looked into its depths. He saw a vision of the future, a world of machines and cities, and he knew that his role as a protector would always be necessary. He returned to the Davenport homestead as the first heat of summer arrived. The air was heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine and the salt of the Atlantic. He stood on the cliffs, looking out at the Aquila anchored in the cove below. He knew that there were still Templar remnants in the cities and that the new nation would face many trials. He checked the hidden blade on his wrist, the metal cool and familiar. He was Connor, a son of the forest and a master of the Brotherhood. He had found his truth in the middle of a revolution, and he would continue to stand in the shadows, protecting the light of liberty. The eagle circled high above, its golden eyes watching the land. Connor turned back toward the manor, his stride steady and strong. He had a community to lead, a creed to uphold, and a future to build. He felt the presence of Achilles and his mother in the wind, a quiet reminder of why he fought. He walked through the front door of the house and closed it behind him, the sound echoing through the halls. The story of the revolution was finished, but the story of the American Brotherhood was just beginning. The war for independence had officially ended, but the struggle for the soul of the new nation was only just starting. The air in the colonies was no longer thick with the smell of gunpowder, but it was filled with the nervous energy of people trying to build something out of nothing. Connor spent most of his time at the homestead, which had become a true sanctuary. He spent his mornings working alongside the people of the land, helping them clear new fields or repair the docks after a heavy storm. He found that the physical labor helped quiet the restless thoughts in his mind. The scent of fresh-cut cedar and the salty mist from the Atlantic became the backdrop of his new life. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a leader responsible for the lives of those who had sought refuge on his shores. He began to use the resources of the manor to reach out to the scattered remains of the Brotherhood in other lands. He spent long nights in the study, writing letters by the light of a single candle. The room was quiet, with only the scratching of his quill and the distant sound of the waves to keep him company. He learned of assassins in France and the Caribbean, sharing the lessons he had learned from Achilles and his own experiences in the revolution. He realized that the Templars were like a weed that had been cut back, but not uprooted. They were already moving into the new government positions, using the language of the new republic to hide their desire for control. Connor knew he had to be vigilant, watching the new leaders of America as closely as he had watched the British. One afternoon, a messenger arrived from Philadelphia with news of a growing conflict. The men who had fought in the war were being ignored by the new politicians, and many were losing their farms because of debts. Connor felt a familiar spark of anger. He saw that the freedom they had fought for was not being shared equally. He decided to travel south to see the situation for himself. The air on the road was warm and dusty, the summer heat pressing down on the green fields of the countryside. He saw the same men who had stood at Lexington now standing in bread lines, their uniforms tattered and their faces hollow. It was a reminder that the victory at Yorktown had not fixed everything. In Philadelphia, the air was heavy with the smell of horse manure and the crowded docks. The city was a hive of activity, with men in fine silk suits debating laws in stone buildings, while the poor struggled in the alleys nearby. Connor met with some of his old contacts from the war, men who had served under Washington. They spoke of the unfairness of the new taxes and the way the land was being sold to wealthy speculators. Connor realized that his war was moving from the battlefield to the halls of law. He began to track the men who were pushing for these unfair policies, finding that many had ties to the same groups Hatham had once led. The Templar influence was shifting, adapting to the new world. He spent his nights on the rooftops of the city, watching the homes of the powerful. The air was cooler up high, carrying the scent of wood smoke from 1,000 chimneys. He saw secret meetings taking place behind closed doors, where men discussed how to keep the common people from having too much power. Connor did not use his blade this time. Instead, he used the information he gathered to help the local organizers. He leaked documents and exposed the greed of the speculators, using the truth to fight the hidden control. He was learning that a well-placed secret could be just as effective as a tomahawk in the right circumstances. During his time in the city, he had a chance encounter with a young man who reminded him of himself years ago. The boy was an orphan, living on the streets and stealing to survive. Connor saw the potential in him, the way he moved through the crowd without being seen, and the sharp intelligence in his eyes. He decided to bring the boy back to the homestead, marking the beginning of a new generation of students. The air on the journey back felt lighter, as if he were finally beginning to fulfill the promise he made to Achilles. He named the boy Stefan and began to teach him the basics of survival and the importance of the creed. Back at the homestead, Connor focused on formalizing the training of his new recruits. He set up a training ground in the woods, using the natural terrain to teach them how to climb, hunt, and fight. The air was often filled with the sound of clashing wooden practice swords and the shouts of the students. He taught them that an assassin's greatest strength is their connection to the people they protect. He made them spend time working in the fields and helping the craftsmen, ensuring they understood the value of the lives they were guarding. He wanted them to be more than just killers. He wanted them to be guardians of the community. He also continued to maintain the Aquila, knowing that the sea would always be a vital part of his reach. He and Faulkner took the ship out on regular patrols along the coast, keeping an eye out for smugglers and Templar ships. The air on the open ocean was invigorating, a world of blue water and white spray. Connor felt a deep connection to the ship, seeing it as a symbol of the Brotherhood's ability to move and adapt. He learned every rope and every plank, becoming a true master of the vessel. The crew respected him, not just as a commander, but as a man who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty alongside them. As the years passed, the homestead grew into a small, prosperous town. The air was always full of the sounds of industry and the smell of salt and pine. Connor remained a quiet, central figure, always watching over the land. He felt the absence of Achilles and his mother, but he also felt their presence in the peace he had helped create. He knew that the world would always have challenges and that the Templars would never truly go away. But he was no longer alone in his fight. He had a family, a brotherhood, and a home. He he sat on the cliffs one evening, watching the sun set over the Atlantic. The sky was a brilliant orange and purple, reflecting in the calm water of the cove. He thought about the vision of the eagle and the path he had traveled. He was a man of the forest, a master of the city, and a protector of a new nation. He took a deep breath of the cool evening air, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. He was Connor, and his story was far from over, but he had found his place in the world. He turned back toward the manor. The light in the windows, a warm welcome in the coming dark. The turn of the century brought a new kind of cold to the frontier. The air was crisp, and the expansion of the new nation felt like a heavy tide moving westward. Connor spent more of his time traveling between the homestead and the deep forests, where the tribal lands met the new settlements. He saw that the promises made during the revolution were being forgotten. The new government was hungry for more land, and the air in the frontier was often thick with the tension of two worlds colliding. He acted as a mediator where he could, using his name and his history to prevent small sparks from turning into large fires. He wore his white robes less often now, preferring the simple buckskins and furs of a hunter to move through the woods without drawing the eyes of the soldiers. In the cities, the political air was shifting. The old unity of the revolution had splintered into factions that fought over the power of the federal government. Connor watched as the new leaders built stone banks and large institutions that reminded him of the systems Hatham had once praised. He realized that the Templar ideals of order and control did not need a secret society to flourish. They could grow naturally within any government that valued power over the people. He focused his efforts on protecting the small communities and the common laborers who were being left behind by these changes. He felt the weight of his age in his joints during the long winters, but his eyes remained as sharp as the eagle that still followed him from the cliffs. One winter, word reached him that a group of speculators was using forged documents to take a large section of the valley near his childhood home. The air turned bitter as he rode toward the village. He found that the people there were confused and frightened, facing legal papers they could not read. Connor used the skills Achilles had taught him to investigate the men behind the land grab. He discovered that they were part of a new network of influence that stretched all the way back to New York. He spent his nights in the camps of the surveyors, silently sabotaging their equipment and stealing the forged maps. He was a shadow in the snow, a reminder that the land still had a protector who knew its secrets. He did not use his blades to solve the problem this time. Instead, he traveled to the state capital and confronted the politicians with the evidence of the fraud. He stood in the wooden halls of the assembly, a tall and imposing figure who carried the authority of a man who had seen the birth of the nation. The air in the room was warm from the fireplaces, but it grew cold as he spoke. He reminded the men of the oaths they had taken and the blood that had been shed for freedom. His presence was enough to make the speculators flee and the forged documents be declared void. He saved the land, but he knew it was only a temporary victory. The hunger for the West was a force that even he could not stop forever. Back at the homestead, the training of the new recruits continued. Stefan was growing into a capable man, his movements quick and his mind disciplined. Connor taught them that the creed was not just a set of rules for killing, but a philosophy for living. He made them study the history of the Brotherhood across the world, from the mountains of Masyaf to the canals of Venice. The air in the library was quiet as the students read the translated journals of the older mentors. Connor wanted them to understand that they were part of a chain that stretched back for thousands of years. He felt a sense of pride as he watched them practice their skills, knowing that the flame of the order would continue to burn long after he was gone. The community at the homestead had become a model of what Connor hoped the whole nation could be. People of different backgrounds worked together, sharing the fruits of the land and the protection of the cliffs. The air was full of the sound of children playing and the steady rhythm of the tides. Connor often sat on the porch of the manor in the evenings, watching the stars come out over the Atlantic. He thought of the friends he had lost, Samuel Adams, Paul Revere, and George Washington, and wondered what they would think of the country as it was now. He felt a deep loneliness at times, being one of the few who remembered the true cost of the freedom everyone now took for granted. As the years moved into the 1810s, the threat of another war with the British began to loom. The air in the ports was thick with talk of blockades and impressment. Connor knew that the Aquila would be needed once more. He and Faulkner spent weeks preparing the ship, checking the hull for rot, and ensuring the cannons were clean and ready. The scent of tar and salt was a constant presence as they worked in the cove. Connor felt a grim determination. He did not want another war, but he would not allow the land he had protected to be taken back by the crown. He took the ship out for drills in the rough waters of the North Atlantic, the wind whipping the blue and white flags of the Brotherhood. During one of these patrols, they encountered a British frigate that was harassing a small merchant vessel. The air was filled with the roar of the ocean and the snapping of the sails. Connor took the helm, guiding the Aquila with a steady hand. He used the lessons of the past to outmaneuver the larger ship, using the wind and the waves to stay out of the reach of their heavy guns. The battle was a test of skill and nerve. When the British finally retreated, the crew of the merchant ship cheered, their voices carrying over the water. Connor felt a brief flash of the old excitement, the feeling of being in the right place at the right time. Despite the victories, Connor felt the world changing in ways he did not like. The cities were growing larger and louder, the air filled with the smoke of the first factories. The forests were being thinned, and the wild places he loved were becoming harder to find. He felt like a man out of time, a relic of a revolution that had already been simplified and turned into legends. He spent more time in the gardens of the homestead, finding peace in the simple growth of the plants. The smell of the earth and the sun on his back were the only things that felt unchanged. He realized that his role was shifting from a warrior to a keeper of memory. He spent his nights completing the records of the American Brotherhood, ensuring that every name and every lesson was preserved. He wanted to make sure that the future assassins would know that the struggle for liberty was never easy and never final. The air in the study was cool as he blew out the candle for the night. He looked out the window at the dark outline of the trees against the moonlit sky. He was still the protector of the land, and as long as he had breath, he would continue to stand in the gap between the people and those who sought to rule them. The air in the year 1812 felt heavy, much like the days before the revolution had begun. The scent of salt and damp wood hung over the docks of the homestead as news arrived that the young nation was at war with the British once again. Connor stood on the cliffs, watching the horizon where the gray sky met the darker gray of the Atlantic. He was older now, his movements more measured, but the strength in his shoulders remained. He knew that the homestead, with its thriving community and its hidden secrets, would be a target for any British fleet moving down the coast. He called for Faulkner and the crew of the Aquila, the air filling with the sound of boots on the wooden decks and the rhythmic clatter of the anchor chain. The war was fought differently this time. The British used their massive navy to choke the ports, cutting off the lifeblood of the coastal towns. Connor took the Aquila into the fog-shrouded waters of the North Atlantic, acting as a protector for the smaller ships that were trying to bring supplies to the people. The air on the deck was often freezing, the spray of the sea turning to ice on the rigging. Connor felt the familiar pull of the ocean as he navigated the treacherous shallows where the larger British frigates could not follow. He was not just fighting for a government. He was fighting to keep the people of his land from starving under the weight of the blockade. During one moonless night, the Aquila encountered a British raiding party attempting to land near a small village south of the homestead. The air was silent until the first flare lit up the sky, casting a ghostly red light over the water. Connor led his men in a swift and silent counterattack. They moved through the surf and onto the beach, their shadows blending with the dark rocks. Connor used his tomahawk with the same deadly grace he had used decades ago, the weapon a blur in the dim light. The struggle was brief, but intense, the air filling with the smell of wet sand and black powder. By the time the sun began to rise, the raiding party had been driven back to their ships, and the village was safe. As the war dragged on, Connor realized that the internal threats were just as dangerous as the ones from across the sea. The chaos of the conflict allowed land speculators and corrupt officials to move back into the frontier, preying on the families of men who were away fighting. Connor spent his time between the sea and the forest, a bridge between two fronts. He saw that the spirit of the people was being tested by the long years of hardship. The air in the frontier camps was often thick with the smell of wood smoke and the low murmur of tired voices. He offered what help he could, using the resources of the manor to provide food and medicine to those in need. In the middle of the war, a message arrived from the West. The tribes were being pressured to join the British against the Americans, with promises of their land being returned to them. Connor knew the bitterness of these lies. He traveled into the deep woods to speak with the tribal leaders, the air smelling of dry leaves and pine. He told them of his own experiences and the way the British had burned his village despite their promises of protection. He spoke of the need for the people of the land to remain independent of the wars of the pale-skinned men. His words carried the weight of a man who had seen the truth behind the banners of both sides. He returned to the homestead to find that the community had grown even stronger in his absence. The people he had saved over the years were now the ones protecting the land. The blacksmith was forging tools and weapons for the local militia, and the farmers were sharing their harvests with the refugees from the war-torn cities. The air in the valley felt vibrant and full of a quiet, stubborn hope. Connor realized that this was the true legacy of the Brotherhood. It was not just about the hidden blades or the secret codes. It was about the strength of a community that looked out for one another. He felt a deep sense of peace seeing the children playing near the docks. Their laughter, a sharp contrast to the distant sound of the cannons. The war eventually came to an end with the signing of a treaty, but the world had changed once more. The air of the new era was filled with the sound of the first steam engines and the sight of larger factories rising in the north. Connor knew his time as a warrior was coming to a natural close. He spent his days at the manor, organizing the archives and ensuring that the history of the American assassins was complete. He worked in the gardens, the smell of the earth and the warmth of the sun, a comfort to his aging bones. He looked out at the ocean, knowing that the Aquila was safely anchored and that the Brotherhood was in the hands of the capable men and women he had trained. He took Stefan, who was now a master in his own right, down to the hidden cellar. The air was cool and smelled of damp stone and history. He showed him the journals and the maps, explaining that the fight for freedom would always change its shape, but would never end. He told the younger man that the most important weapon was not the blade, but the wisdom to know when to use it and when to let it rest. Connor felt a sense of pride as he watched Stefan take the oath, the torchlight flickering on the walls of the cave. The cycle was continuing, and the light of the creed would not go out. Connor spent a final evening on the cliffs, the air cool and the stars bright. He thought of his mother, Achilles, and even his father. He realized that his life had been a long and difficult journey, but it had led him to this place of peace. He was a son of the forest who had helped build a nation, and he was at rest with the path he had chosen. The eagle circled one last time before disappearing into the darkness of the trees. Connor turned back toward the manor, his heart full. He had protected the land. He had built a home, and he had secured the future of the Brotherhood. The years that followed the war brought a different kind of quiet to the Davenport homestead. The air in the valley was soft, filled with the hum of bees in the gardens and the rhythmic splash of the tide against the cliffs. Connor moved with a slower pace now, his hair turning the color of the winter clouds, but his presence remained as steady as the stone walls of the manor. He spent his mornings walking the perimeter of the land, not to hunt or to scout for enemies, but to appreciate the life that had taken root there. The smell of blooming clover and the salt air of the coast were the only things he required. He had become a grandfather figure to the children of the homestead, a man of few words but great kindness, who told stories of the forest and the stars. The manor house itself became a library and a place of learning for the Brotherhood. The air in the study was always dry and smelled of the old leather bindings of the books Connor had collected from across the world. He spent his afternoons sitting at the heavy oak desk, translating the journals of the mentors who had come before him. He wanted to ensure that the knowledge of the past was available to the assassins of the future, so they would not have to learn the hard lessons of war as he had. He wrote about the balance between order and freedom, and the danger of letting anger guide the blade. His hand was steady as he filled the pages, the scratching of the quill the only sound in the quiet room. Stefan and the other recruits had taken over the active work of the Order, traveling to the growing cities of New York and Washington to keep a silent watch. They returned to the homestead, often to report on the state of the nation. The air during these meetings was serious, but no longer heavy with the desperation of the revolution. Connor listened as they spoke of new laws, the expansion of the railroads, and the shifting power of the political parties. He saw that the Templars were still there, moving in the shadows of the banks and the government offices. But he also saw that the Brotherhood was stronger and more organized than it had ever been. He had succeeded in rebuilding what had been lost. One evening, a young woman arrived at the gate, carrying a letter from a distant branch of the Order in the West. She spoke of the struggle to protect the plains and the people who lived there from the relentless push of the new industry. Connor saw the same fire in her eyes that he had once carried. He spent several days talking with her, sharing his knowledge of the land and the importance of patience. He told her that the work of a protector is never truly finished, but that one must find peace within the struggle. The air in the garden was cool as they sat together, the scent of lavender and earth surrounding them. When she left, she carried a new sense of purpose and a copy of the lessons Connor had recorded. As his strength began to fade, Connor spent more time on the porch, looking out at the ocean. He felt a deep connection to the water, the same vast and unchanging force that had brought him both his greatest enemies and his greatest friends. He thought of the Aquila, which was now under the command of a new captain, patrolling the coast to keep the homestead safe. He felt no regret for the choices he had made. He had avenged his mother, protected his people as long as he could, and built a sanctuary for those who had nowhere else to go. The air was filled with the sound of the wind in the trees, a constant and comforting presence that reminded him of the forests of his youth. He also made peace with the memory of his father. He realized that Hatham had been a man of his time, caught in a cycle of control that he believed was right. Connor no longer felt the sharp edge of the old anger. Instead, he felt a quiet sadness for the man who had never known the peace of a home like the one at the homestead. He understood that the struggle between the two orders was a part of the human story, a balance that would always exist. The air in the valley felt neutral and calm, reflecting the clarity he had found in his old age. He was a man who had seen the worst of humanity and still believed in its potential for good. The community at the homestead continued to flourish, even as the world outside became more crowded and loud. The people there looked after one another, sharing their skills and their harvests. The air was always full of the smell of fresh bread from the bakery and the sound of the blacksmith's hammer. Connor saw that he had created something that would outlast him, a place where the ideals of the creed were lived every day, not just spoken. He felt a sense of completion, knowing that he had fulfilled the mission the elders had given him so long ago. He had found the truth, and it had allowed him to build a life of meaning. In his final months, he spent a lot of time in the small graveyard on the hill. He sat by the markers for his mother and Achilles, the air cool and the grass long. He spoke to them in his heart, telling them of the things he had seen and the world he was leaving behind. He felt a readiness for the next transition, a sense that he was just a part of a much larger cycle of life. He was not afraid of the silence. He had lived a life of action and noise, and he found the quiet of the hill to be a gift. The stars above were the same ones that had guided him through the frontier, a steady and familiar light in the dark. He passed away quietly in his sleep, in the same manor house that had seen so much history. He was found in the morning, looking as though he were just resting after a long day of work. The homestead was silent as the news spread, a heavy and respectful stillness that lasted for days. They buried him on the hill, next to Achilles, looking out over the water he had protected. There were no grand speeches, only the sound of the wind and the waves. He was returned to the earth he had loved so hard, a son of the land who had become its greatest guardian. The legacy of Connor Kenway remained a guiding force for the American Brotherhood for generations. The homestead continued to be a secret heart of the order, a place where the history was kept and the future was planned. The air in the valley stayed sweet and the cliffs remained strong, a silent witness to the man who had stood his ground when the world was changing. He had shown that one person, driven by honor and a love for their people, could change the course of a nation. The story of the revolution was in the books, but the spirit of the protector was in the land itself. The homestead remained a place of secrets long after the wooden fences had rotted and the fields had returned to the forest. As the decades passed and the 19th century turned into the 20th, the physical structure of the manor began to fade into the landscape. The air in the valley was quiet once more, reclaimed by the rustle of oak leaves and the steady rhythm of the Atlantic tides. Yet, beneath the earth and within the hidden spaces of the stone foundation, the legacy of the Brotherhood was preserved. The heavy iron door of the cellar stayed locked, protecting the journals and the maps that Connor had so carefully organized. The scent of damp stone and old ink lingered in that underground sanctuary, a time capsule of an era when the world was being reshaped by fire and steel. In the cities that grew around the old frontier, the influence of the American Brotherhood could be seen in the very way the society was built. The principles of equality and the protection of the common people that Connor had fought for became part of the laws of the new nation. The air in the modern offices and the busy streets of Boston and New York carried the echo of the old struggle. While the Templar ideals of control moved into the boardrooms of large corporations, the assassins adapted. They no longer wore the white hoods or carried the heavy tomahawks, but they remained the silent guardians of the light. They were the journalists who exposed corruption and the lawyers who fought for the rights of the workers, using the truth as their primary weapon. The Davenport homestead itself became a legend within the global order. Assassins from far-off lands would hear stories of the sanctuary on the cliffs and the mentor who had built a community out of the ruins of a war. The air of the homestead was said to be special, a place where the connection to the earth was still strong and the purpose of the creed was still clear. Those who managed to find the hidden path to the valley found a place of profound peace. They would visit the small graveyard on the hill, standing in the cool salt breeze to pay their respects to the man who had bridged the gap between two worlds. They found that the spirit of the place gave them the strength to continue their own difficult missions. Tracing the bloodline of Connor was a task that the Order took seriously. His descendants were scattered across the continent, some living in the busy cities and others returning to the ancestral lands of the Kanien'keha. They did not always know the full history of their family, but many carried a natural sense of justice and a deep respect for the natural world. The air around them seemed to carry a spark of the old fire. The Brotherhood watched over them from a distance, ensuring that the legacy of the Auditor and the Kenway families was never completely lost. They were the quiet holders of a history that the rest of the world had forgotten, a link to the moments when a single person changed the course of time. The hidden artifacts that Connor had recovered, including the glass orb and the rings of the Templar leaders, were eventually moved to more secure locations. The air in the modern vaults was dry and filtered, a stark contrast to the wood smoke and earth of the frontier. These items were studied by the scholars of the Order, who looked for clues about the ancient ones who had come before. They saw that Connor had played a vital role in keeping these dangerous powers out of the hands of those who would use them to enslave humanity. The objects remained silent, but they carried the weight of the lives that had been sacrificed to protect them. As the world entered the age of technology, the story of the revolution and the American Brotherhood was stored in digital archives and hidden servers. The air in these server rooms was hummed with the sound of cooling fans and the flicker of blue lights. The journals were scanned and translated into every language, allowing the wisdom of the mentor to reach assassins across the globe. Connor's lessons on the importance of community and the responsibility of freedom became more relevant than ever in a world that felt increasingly disconnected. The digital pages carried the same truth that had once been written with a quill by candlelight, showing that the core of the creed remains unchanged regardless of the tools used. The land where the homestead once stood was eventually designated as a protected forest, ensuring that the trees and the cliffs would remain as they were in Connor's time. The air there remains fresh and full of the scent of pine and salt. Hikers and explorers who wander through the valley often speak of a feeling of being watched, not by something hostile, but by a quiet and watchful presence. They see the eagle circling high above the cliffs, a shape that has not changed in hundreds of years. They find a sense of peace in the silence of the woods, unaware that they are walking on the ground where a great warrior once found his home. The story of Connor Kenway is a reminder that the work of an assassin is not just about the moments of violence, but about the long years of building and protecting. He showed that it is possible to live a life of honor, even in a world filled with betrayal and greed. The air of history is filled with the names of kings and generals, but the Brotherhood remembers the man who stood in the shadows. He was the son of a fallen order and the father of a new one, a man who gave everything to ensure that the light of liberty would never be fully extinguished. His journey was a long one, but it led to a world where hope still has a place to grow. The memory of the mentor continues to inspire those who find themselves caught between two worlds. His life was a testament to the fact that our heritage does not define our destiny, and that we have the power to choose our own path. The air of the future is still unwritten, but it will be shaped by those who have the courage to follow the example of the man from the forest. The creed remains a guide, a silent whisper in the ears of those who seek the truth. As long as there are those who value freedom over control, the spirit of the homestead will live on, a beacon in the dark for all who seek a better world. The cycle of the Brotherhood continues, moving through the ages like the tide against the cliffs. The story of the American Revolution was just one chapter in a much larger book, but it was one that defined the character of the Order for centuries to come. Connor's work was finished, but the mission goes on, a steady and relentless pursuit of a world where every person is free to find their own truth. The air is still, the sun is rising, and the next chapter is about to begin. The story of the American Brotherhood is a story of a bridge. It is the bridge between the ancient traditions of the old world and the wild, uncertain potential of the new world. When Connor first stepped onto the porch of the Davenport homestead, he was a young man looking for a way to save his home. By the time he laid his mentor to rest, he had become the foundation for a new kind of freedom. The air of this final reflection is clear and still, like the moments before dawn when the world feels full of possibility. The lesson of Connor's life is that justice is not something that is found once and kept forever. It is something that must be built every day through the work of our hands and the choices of our hearts. The American creed, as shaped by Connor, was different from the versions that came before it in Europe or the East. It was grounded in the soil and the forest, valuing the independence of the individual as much as the strength of the community. The air of this creed is the air of the frontier, vast, open, and demanding. It taught the assassins that they could not simply be shadows in the dark. They had to be part of the light, helping the people around them to grow and thrive. This shifted the focus of the Order from a secret war of elite warriors to a movement of guardians who lived among the people they protected. It was a more human way of following the path, and it made the Brotherhood more resilient than ever before. Looking at the global history of the Order, Connor stands as a unique figure who proved that the blood of the enemy does not have to dictate the heart of the sun. He carried the legacy of the Kenways and the Auditors, but he forged a path that was entirely his own. The air of history is filled with the stories of those who sought to conquer, but Connor's story is about those who seek to preserve. He showed that the true strength of an assassin lies in their ability to love something greater than themselves, a family, a community, or a land. This love was the fire that kept him moving through the snow of Valley Forge and the smoke of New York. And it is the light that still guides the Order today. The homestead itself remains the greatest symbol of this legacy. It was a place where a blacksmith, a doctor, a farmer, and an assassin could all sit at the same table and share a meal. The air in that dining room was the true goal of the revolution. It represented a world where titles and origins did not matter as much as the contribution a person made to their neighbors. Connor understood that the Templars would always try to separate people into ranks and classes, using fear to maintain order. By building a place where everyone was equal, he created a weapon against the Templar ideology that was more powerful than any blade. He proved that freedom is not just the absence of a king, but the presence of a community. As we close this chapter of the journey, we see that the story of Assassin's Creed 3 is not just about a war for independence between nations. It is a war for independence within the human spirit. Connor walked the difficult path between his indigenous roots and his colonial responsibilities, never fully belonging to either, but serving both with honor. The air of his memory is the air of the mountain, high, lonely, but with a view that sees the whole world. He taught us that even when the world is burning around us, we can still plant the seeds of a better future. He lived his life with the patience of the forest and the strength of the sea, leaving behind a world that was slightly kinder and much more free. The eagle still circles the cliffs of the Atlantic, and the waves still beat against the stones of the hidden cave. The manor on the hill may be gone, but the truth it housed is still alive in the hearts of those who seek it. The air is quiet now. The long struggle of the American Revolution settled into the peace of history. Connor Kenway, the boy who ran through the flames to become the mentor of a nation, has found his rest. His story is a part of the wind, a part of the earth, and a part of the silent creed that continues to watch over the world. The journey is complete, and the light of the morning is finally here. The path of the assassin is a long one, stretching through time and across continents. From the deserts of the east to the forests of the west, the mission remains the same: to protect the freedom of humanity and to ensure that the truth is never lost. Connor's chapter is finished, but the book remains open. The heir of the future is waiting for the next person to take up the blade and the hood, carrying the lessons of the past into the challenges of tomorrow. The world is wide, the shadows are deep, but the light of the creed will never truly fade as long as there are those who remember the story of the protector from the frontier.